Ranger Sarah Mitchell had been patrolling the quiet trails of Cedar Ridge National Park for nearly a decade, watching the seasons paint their colors across the ancient forests like an ever-changing canvas. She loved the stillness of the early mornings, the way the fog clung to the trees like an ancient secret, wrapping around trunks and branches in gossamer tendrils that seemed almost alive in the dim light. The smell of pine needles and moss had become as familiar to her as her own breath, and the soft crunch of leaves beneath her boots was a comfort she'd grown to cherish. But even in her years of experience, even after countless miles of trails memorized like the lines on her own palm, she'd never been to the farthest edges of the park. Not until now. The trail to the park's remote northeast corner was overgrown, a winding path long neglected due to lack of visitors. Thick undergrowth reached across the narrow trail, like grasping fingers, and fallen branches created natural barriers that seemed to warn against further progress. Most hikers stuck to the well-trodden loops near the main campground, where maintained paths and regular ranger patrols provided a sense of security. Sarah only ventured out this way because of a report from a historian researching the area, Dr. Peter Lang. He'd claimed there was a tree with carvings, names, and dates that might predate the park's establishment. His voice had trembled with excitement over the phone, and something else she couldn't quite identify. Curious, Sarah volunteered to check it out during her routine rounds, though she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to his request than simple academic interest. The morning was crisp as she stepped onto the overgrown path, her boots crunching on frost-kissed leaves that sparkled like scattered diamonds in the early light. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, rich with the decay of fallen leaves and the mustiness of old-growth forest. The faint calls of chickadees provided a serene soundtrack to her hike, their cheerful notes echoing through the canopy above. But as the trail narrowed and the forest deepened, Sarah noticed an unnatural quiet settling in, as though the woods themselves were holding their breath. No birds, no rustling leaves, just her own breathing and the steady rhythm of her boots against the increasingly narrow path. The silence pressed against her ears like cotton wool, making every snap of a twig under her feet sound like a gunshot in the stillness. The tree was impossible to miss, rising from the forest floor like an ancient sentinel. It towered above the surrounding forest, its gnarled branches reaching skyward like frozen claws against the pale morning sky. The bark was thick and dark, almost black in places, with deep furrows that seemed to shift in the filtered sunlight. As Sarah approached, she saw the carvings, hundreds of them, names and initials etched deeply into the bark. Some were weathered and illegible, worn smooth by decades of rain and wind, while others looked impossibly crisp and recent, as though carved moments before her arrival. She pulled out her phone to take photos, stepping closer to examine the markings. The screen flickered briefly as she raised it, but she dismissed it as a trick of the light filtering through the canopy. Her fingers trembled slightly as she focused on the first set of names. Thomas Black, 1937. Lydia Wells, 1952. Alan Cooper, 1978. The list went on, dozens of names spiraling up the trunk in a macabre timeline of visitors. What struck Sarah as odd was how the carvings spanned decades, yet no one seemed to have mentioned the tree before. No hikers had reported it, no maintenance crews had marked it, no historical surveys had documented it. It felt deliberately hidden, its location far from the main trails, as though the forest itself had grown around it to keep it secret. As she traced her fingers over the bark, feeling the rough texture and the smooth indentations of the carvings, she noticed something else. A faint outline of letters forming her name, like someone was carving from inside the tree, pushing the letters outward. Sarah Mitchell, 2023. She yanked her hand back, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. The letters weren't fully formed, just faint impressions, but they were unmistakable. Her name, her full name, appearing before her eyes. What the hell? She muttered, stepping back. Her voice sounded strange in the absolute silence, muffled as though the air itself was thick enough to catch and hold the sound. She scanned the forest, half expecting to see someone, a prankster perhaps, or another ranger playing an elaborate joke, but the woods were empty, still unnaturally quiet, the branches above her motionless, despite the chill breeze she could feel on her skin. That night, Sarah couldn't shake the image of the tree. It haunted her thoughts like a half-remembered nightmare. The sight of those names burned into her mind's eye. Back at the ranger station, she pulled up park records, hoping to find some mention of it. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, searching through decades of surveys, maintenance reports, and visitor logs. But her search turned up nothing. There were no maps marking the tree's location, no references in historical documents, not even a passing mention in old ranger reports. It was as if the tree existed in a blind spot, a dark corner of the park that documentation couldn't quite capture. The historian who'd reported it, Dr. Peter Lang, had left his contact information, so she gave him a call. The phone rang several times, each ring seeming to echo in the empty station, before he answered. "Ah, the tree," Lang said, his voice crackling over the line like dead leaves. "Did you find it?" "I did," Sarah replied, unconsciously lowering her voice, though she was alone in the station. "There are dozens of names carved into it. Some of them are really old. Do you know anything about its history?" Lang hesitated, the silence stretching between them like a cobweb. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, becoming tighter, more controlled. "Not much, I'm afraid. I stumbled across a vague mention of it in a settler's journal from the 1800s. It was described as a marker of loss. I thought it might be tied to early logging camps or something darker." "Darker?" Sarah pressed, her free hand clutching the edge of her desk. The journal hinted that those who carved their names did so as a warning. They never left the forest. The writer described it as a hungry place, though that could have been superstition. The frontier was full of such tales. A chill ran down Sarah's spine, raising goosebumps along her arms. "You're saying it's a grave marker?" "Possibly, or something worse." Lang's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. The journal entries became erratic near the end. The writer claimed to hear voices, whispers in the dark. He wrote about names appearing on the tree, names of people who were still alive. Shortly after, the journal entries stopped. The whispers began the next day. Sarah was back on the trail, determined to document the tree more thoroughly. The morning was overcast, the sky a solid sheet of gray that made the forest seem darker, more oppressive. She carried a notebook, a camera, and a growing sense of unease that seemed to weight down each step. The forest was quiet again, the silence so deep it pressed against her ears like she was underwater. As she approached the tree, she heard it. Faint, indistinct whispers, like voices carried on the wind, though not a single leaf moved on the branches above. She froze, her pulse quickening until she could feel it in her throat. "Hello?" she called out, her voice sounding small and lost in the vast silence. The whispers stopped, leaving a vacuum of sound that seemed to pull at her ears. Sarah shook her head, trying to dismiss the sound as her imagination, a trick of the wind through the trees. But as she began photographing the tree, carefully documenting each name and date, the whispers returned, louder this time. She couldn't make out the words, but they seemed to come from all around her, overlapping and chaotic, like a crowd of people all speaking at once just below the threshold of comprehension. Then she heard her name. Sarah. She spun around, her camera slipping from her hands and hitting the ground with a dull thud that seemed to echo in the unnatural silence. The forest was empty, but the whispers persisted, soft and insistent, like dozens of voices speaking just behind her ears. Her breathing grew shallow, and she backed away from the tree, her boots crunching on frost that shouldn't have been there in the warming day. She didn't stop until she was back at the station, her hands shaking so badly she could barely unlock the door. Over the next few days, Sarah's unease deepened into a constant, gnawing dread. The whispers followed her, faint at first, but growing louder when she was alone. They were barely noticeable during the day, when the normal sounds of the park provided a buffer. But in quiet moments, they would creep in like smoke under a door. At night, she dreamed of the tree, its gnarled branches reaching for her, its carvings glowing faintly in the darkness, like phosphorescent wounds in its bark. She began noticing strange things around the station, papers misplaced, her name scrawled in the margins of her logs, as though written by an unseen hand. Sometimes she would catch movement out of the corner of her eye, only to turn and find nothing there. Her colleagues noticed her unease, the dark circles under her eyes, the way she jumped at sudden sounds. "You've been distracted," her supervisor, Mark, said one evening as she was finishing up her reports. "Everything okay?" Sarah hesitated, her pen hovering over the paper. She could hear the whispers even now, a soft susurration just at the edge of hearing. "Have you ever heard of a tree with carvings? Out past the Northeast Trail?" Mark frowned, leaning against her desk. "Can't say I have. Why?" She considered telling him about the whispers, about the way her name had appeared on the tree, about the dreams that left her gasping in the dark. But the words stuck in her throat. It sounded ridiculous, the kind of story that would end with a psychiatric evaluation and a leave of absence. Instead, she said, "No reason, just something I came across." Desperate for answers, Sarah returned to the tree one last time. She arrived just before dusk, the setting sun casting long shadows across the forest floor like bars of a cage. The whispers began almost immediately, faint but insistent, a chorus of voices that seemed to rise from the ground itself. This time, she didn't back away. "What do you want?" she demanded, her voice trembling but determined. The whispers grew louder, coalescing into a single voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Stay." Sarah's heart pounded, the sound drowning out everything but that terrible voice. "Why?" "You are one of us now," the voice said, the words chillingly clear, as though spoken directly into her mind. "Your name is written." She stepped closer to the tree, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The beam caught the carvings, making them seem to shift and writhe like living things. New names appeared before her eyes, carving themselves into the bark with invisible tools. At the base of the trunk, she saw her own name, fully formed now, Sarah Mitchell, 2023. The letters seemed to weep sap, dark and thick in the failing light. "No," she whispered, stumbling back. "This isn't real." The tree groaned, its branches creaking as though it were alive, really alive. Not just with the passive life of plants, but with something hungry and aware. The ground beneath her feet seemed to shift, roots breaking through the soil like reaching hands. The whispers grew deafening, a cacophony of voices pleading, warning, demanding. She could make out words now, fragments of final moments. "Help us. Don't leave. Forever here." Sarah turned and ran, the forest blurring around her. Branches seemed to reach for her, trying to snag her clothing, to hold her back. She didn't stop until she reached the ranger station, slamming the door behind her. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her hands shaking as she locked the door, though she knew locks wouldn't keep out what was following her. That night, Sarah packed her belongings with trembling hands. She couldn't stay, not after what she'd seen, not with the whispers growing louder every day. She left a note for Mark, vaguely citing personal reasons for her departure. By sunrise, she was gone, driving away from Cedar Ridge as fast as she dared, watching the forest recede in her rearview mirror. Weeks later, she received a call from one of her former colleagues, She almost didn't answer, but something compelled her to pick up the phone. "Hey," he said, his tone hesitant, worried. "I know you're probably done with the park, but we found something. A tree, out by the Northeast Trail. Mark went to check it out after finding your note, but..." Sarah's blood ran cold, the phone nearly slipping from her suddenly numb fingers. "But what?" "We found his name on it, and now he's missing. 3 days, no trace. Just like the others we found in the records, the ones whose names were carved." The line went silent, and Sarah realized the whispers had followed her, faint but unmistakable, even miles away from Cedar Ridge. They were clearer now, and she could hear Mark's voice among them, calling her name. "Stay." She looked down at her arm, where letters were slowly appearing on her skin, carving themselves from within. "Come back to us."
Joel Kramer had worked in Alaska's backcountry for nearly 2 decades. His weathered face and calloused hands, testament to countless days spent patrolling its vast wilderness. As a park ranger stationed in one of the remotest stretches of the Tongass National Forest, he'd seen his fair share of oddities, eerie weather patterns that defied meteorological explanation, strange animal behaviors that contradicted everything he'd learned in his training, and the occasional disoriented hiker swearing they'd heard voices in the woods. It all came with the territory, part of the peculiar tapestry of life in America's last true wilderness. But the hum, that was something new. Something that would eventually make him question everything he thought he knew about the natural world. It started subtly, like most things that eventually destroy your peace of mind. Joel first noticed it on a quiet evening while patrolling near Pinecrest Trail, a seldom used path that wound through a dense grove of ancient Sitka spruce. The massive trees loomed overhead, their branches intertwining so thickly they created a natural cathedral ceiling that filtered the waning daylight into ghostly shapes on the forest floor. The air had been unusually still, the kind of stillness that makes your ears strain for any sound, and as twilight settled like a heavy blanket over the landscape, he'd pause to take in the fading light. That's when he heard it, a low, resonant sound, almost like the hum of a tuning fork struck by an unseen hand. It was faint, so faint he thought he might have imagined it, nothing more than the product of an overactive imagination in the gathering darkness. But the longer he stood there, feet rooted to the moss-covered ground, the clearer it became. A deep, rhythmic vibration that seemed to emanate from the trees themselves, as if the ancient spruces had finally decided to give voice to centuries of silent watching. Wind through the branches, he'd told himself, though the air was motionless as death. His scientific mind grasped for rational explanations, distant machinery, underground water movement, even the aurora borealis, which sometimes created audible phenomena, shrugging it off with the practiced ease of someone used to explaining away the inexplicable. He'd returned to the ranger station, dismissing the hum as nothing more than a curious trick of acoustics in the complex terrain of the Alaskan wilderness. But the hum didn't stay confined to that one evening, like most rational explanations should. Instead, it grew, spreading through the forest like an invisible contagion. A week later, Joel's radio crackled to life, static cutting through the perpetual quiet of his small station office. "Joel," came the familiar voice of his colleague Sarah Martinez, a tone of concern evident even through the radio's distortion. "We've got a couple of hikers who need help near the Ridgewater Fork. They're claiming they heard something and got lost trying to follow it. Can you check it out?" Sarah had been working these woods almost as long as Joel, and the note of unease in her voice set off warning bells in his mind. Joel frowned, his hand automatically reaching for his well-worn pack as he processed the location. Ridgewater Fork was close to Pinecrest Trail, too close for comfort. What exactly did they hear? He asked, though he already suspected the answer. Could feel it in the growing heaviness of his gut. Sarah hesitated, radio silence stretching for a moment too long. They said it was singing or maybe humming. Something about it being impossible to ignore. Weird, right? Her attempt at casual dismissal fell flat, laden with unspoken concern. He muttered a response and drove his truck to the trailhead, gravel crunching under the tires like brittle bones. The sun was dipping low by the time he found the hikers, a young couple clutching each other near a moss-covered boulder, their modern outdoor gear incongruous against the primeval backdrop of the forest. Their faces were pale, their voices shaky, and their eyes held that particular look Joel had seen before in people who'd encountered something their minds couldn't quite process. It sounded like music, the woman said, her fingers digging into her partner's jacket. But not like anything I've ever heard. It was beautiful, but wrong. Like a symphony played in a key that shouldn't exist. She swallowed hard, her throat working against some emotion Joel couldn't quite name. We tried to follow it, but the trail just disappeared. It was like the forest shifted around us, like it was leading us somewhere we shouldn't go. Joel escorted them back to safety, maintaining a professional demeanor that betrayed none of his growing unease. But their words stuck with him, echoing in his mind like the hum itself. Beautiful, but wrong. That night, he lay awake in his cabin, staring at the dark ceiling, listening. The hum, faint and distant, seemed to drift through his open window, like an uninvited guest that had finally found its way home. It carried with it a promise of secrets, of knowledge better left buried in the deep places of the earth. Over the next month, the reports multiplied like darkness spreading across an evening sky. Hikers claimed to hear the hum, each description adding another layer to its mysterious nature. They spoke of a deep, vibrating resonance that seemed to pull them off the trails, a sound that bypassed their ears and spoke directly to something primitive in their brains. The incidents piled up on Joel's desk like autumn leaves. A solo hiker found wandering in circles, mumbling about the song of the earth. A family of 4 who abandoned their campsite, leaving behind everything but the clothes on their backs. A wildlife photographer whose cameras had captured nothing but static and strange shadows. Several returned shaken, their eyes holding that same vacant look, insisting the sound was alive, not just a noise, but something with intent, with hunger. Joel, skeptical by nature and trained to seek logical explanations, initially chalked it up to mass hysteria, the way fear could spread through a community like wildfire. The wilderness had a way of playing tricks on people, of amplifying their deepest fears until they saw monsters in every shadow. But as the incidents piled up, he couldn't ignore the patterns anymore. Then he could ignore the way the hum had begun to invade his dreams. One evening, as the late summer sun painted the sky in shades of blood and gold, he decided to investigate Pinecrest Trail again. The decision felt both inevitable and foolish, like walking willingly into the mouth of something ancient and hungry. He parked his truck at the trailhead, the cooling engine ticking like a countdown in the gathering dusk. The hum greeted him almost immediately, faint but unmistakable, like a distant choir singing in a language too old for human tongues. Joel paused, straining to pinpoint its source, but it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, as if the very air had learned to sing. His boots crunched on the needle-strewn path, each step taking him deeper into the grove where the trees grew so thick they seemed to be watching, their bark-covered faces turned inward to track his progress. As he walked deeper into the grove, the sound grew louder, more defined, It wasn't just a hum anymore. It had texture, like overlapping tones harmonizing in a low hypnotic rhythm that made his teeth ache and his vision blur at the edges. The ground beneath his boots vibrated subtly, as though the forest itself were purring with dark satisfaction. The air grew thick and heavy, carrying the musty scent of decay and something else. Something metallic and ancient. At the trail's end, Joel stumbled upon something that shouldn't have been there. Something that hadn't been visible on any of his previous patrols. A scattering of old mining equipment, half buried in moss and memories. Rusted pickaxes lay like discarded bones, their handles rotted to nothing. A crumbling wheelbarrow listed to one side, its wheel frozen in an eternal turn. A collapsed wooden structure, the remnants of a camp long abandoned, jutted from the earth like the ribcage of some massive, decaying beast. The scene felt wrong, as if he'd walked into a photograph from another time that had somehow superimposed itself onto the present. He crouched, ignoring the way his skin crawled with unseen electricity, and brushed away decades of debris to reveal a broken lantern. The metal was corroded, but he could still make out words etched into its base. Ridgewater Mining Co. The discovery sat in his stomach like a stone, heavy with implications he wasn't ready to face. Joel frowned, his ranger's knowledge warring with this new evidence. He'd never heard of a mining operation in this area, and the park's records made no mention of it. As he stood, knees creaking in protest, the hum surged with sudden violence. The sound pressed against his skull like a physical force, carrying with it impressions of deep places and darker secrets, of men driven mad by what they found beneath the earth. "Time to go," he muttered, backing away from the sight. His voice sounded thin and meaningless against the forest's ancient song. The trees seemed to lean closer, their branches reaching like grasping fingers, and for a moment he could have sworn he saw shapes moving in the deepening shadows. Shapes that had nothing to do with wind or wildlife. Back at the ranger station, surrounded by the comforting normality of fluorescent lights and filing cabinets, Joel pored over old maps and records. Hours slipped by as he searched for any mention of Ridgewater Mining Co., his coffee growing cold beside him. The park's official documents offered nothing but silence, as if the company had been carefully excised from history. The absence of information felt deliberate, a blank space where truth should have been. Frustrated, he reached out to Sarah, hoping her decade-plus of experience might shed some light on the mystery. The phone rang 3 times before she answered, her voice thick with sleep despite the early hour. "Ever hear of a mining camp near Pinecrest?" he asked without preamble. She paused, and he could almost see her frown. "Can't say I have. Why?" "Found some old equipment out there," he said, trying to keep his voice casual. "Figured it might explain some of the weirdness. Maybe they hit a pocket of natural gas or something." The explanation sounded hollow even to his own ears. "You think gas is making people hear things?" she asked, skepticism clear in her voice. "Making them all hear the same thing?" "Could be," Joel replied, though he didn't quite believe it himself. The lie tasted bitter on his tongue. The hum persisted through the changing seasons, and so did the incidents. They took on a darker tone as autumn approached, like a predator growing bold with hunger. One afternoon, as rain drummed against the station roof like impatient fingers, Joel received a panicked call from a group of teenage campers. Their friend had wandered off after hearing what they described as singing from inside the mountain. The fear in their voices was raw, primal. Joel found the boy hours later, sitting cross-legged by the mining site, his face blank and his hands trembling like autumn leaves. The teenager's eyes were fixed on something Joel couldn't see, something that had stripped away all the protective layers of civilization and left behind something ancient and terrified. "I had to follow it," the boy mumbled, his voice distant and dreamy. "It was calling me, showing me things. Things under the ground, under the roots, old things, hungry things." His words sent a chill down Joel's spine that had nothing to do with the damp air. Joel escorted the boy back to his group, but his unease had deepened into something approaching certainty. The hum wasn't just a sound, it was something more, something that got into people's heads and rearranged the furniture of their minds, something that was getting stronger. Determined to get answers before winter sealed the wilderness under a blanket of snow and darkness, Joel reached out to a local historian, a retired professor named Dr. Marjorie Grant. They met at her small, cluttered home near the park's edge, where books climbed the walls like ivy, and the air smelled of old paper and wood smoke. She was a tiny woman with sharp eyes and hands that never stopped moving, as if conducting an invisible orchestra. Marjorie listened intently as Joel described the hum and the mining site, her expression growing more troubled with each detail. When he finished, she was silent for a long moment, her fingers tracing patterns on her teacup. "Ridgewater mining," she said finally, tapping her chin. "That's a name I haven't heard in years. Not many left who remember it now." She rose and moved to an ancient filing cabinet, retrieving a yellowed folder. They operated in the 1930s, prospecting for gold. But there was something else, something they found in the deep places. The camp shut down suddenly, without explanation. But there were rumors. "What kind of rumors?" Joel leaned forward, drawn in despite himself. "They said the workers went mad," Marjorie continued, spreading old photographs across her desk. "Claimed the earth was singing to them, calling them. The deeper they dug, the louder it got. Some said they found something down there, something that should have stayed buried." "Singing?" Joel asked, his mouth dry. The photographs showed groups of men standing proud before mine entrances, their faces growing more haunted in each successive image. Marjorie nodded, her eyes distant. "It's just folklore, but they said the sound drove them insane. Some wandered into the forest and never came back, leaving behind half-eaten meals and letters home they never finished. Others turned violent, attacking their fellow workers with picks and shovels, screaming about the voices in the rock. The company buried the story to avoid scandal, sealed the mines, and erased their presence as best they could." Joel felt a chill that seemed to reach into his bones. "Did anyone figure out what caused it?" "No," Marjorie said, closing the folder with a finality that spoke of endings better left unexplored. "But some believe the land holds memories, traumas. The native peoples of this region had stories about places where the boundary between worlds grew thin, where things could slip through from elsewhere. The hum might be the forest's way of speaking, or warning. Or perhaps," she added, her voice dropping to barely a whisper, "it's something else entirely. Something using the forest as a mouth to call to us." That night, Joel couldn't sleep. The hum was louder than ever, resonating through the walls of his cabin like the breathing of some vast, buried creature. It seemed to carry voices now, whispered fragments of sound that almost made sense, almost resolved into words he could understand. He lay in bed, watching shadows dance across his ceiling, until he couldn't stand it anymore. He stepped outside into the autumn night, flashlight in hand, drawn back to Pinecrest Trail like a moth to flame. The forest seemed different in darkness, more alive, more aware. The hum wove through the trees like a living thread, creating patterns of sound that his mind struggled to comprehend. His flashlight beam caught drops of dew on spider webs, making them shine like constellations of tiny watching eyes. At the mining site, Joel found something that hadn't been there before. A pit, freshly exposed as if the earth itself had opened up in hunger. The hum emanated from its depths, with physical force, a pulsating rhythm that made his teeth ache and his vision swim. The sound seemed almost solid now, a thing of texture and weight that pressed against him like invisible hands. He edged closer, drawn by a compulsion he couldn't name, shining his flashlight into the darkness. The beam illuminated jagged rocks slick with moisture, and something else. Something glinting with a light that had nothing to do with his flashlight's reflection. A set of eyes stared back at him from the darkness, eyes that held the weight of eons in their ancient depths. They weren't animal eyes, weren't human eyes, weren't anything that should exist in a world of sunlight and solid ground. They were the eyes of something that had waited in the deep places since before humans learned to walk upright. Something that had been waiting for someone to dig deep enough, to listen long enough, to finally hear its song. Joel stumbled back, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped thing trying to escape. The hum surged, drowning out his thoughts, filling his mind with images of vast underground spaces and things that moved in darkness. It pulled at him with invisible threads, trying to draw him closer to those ancient, hungry eyes. He turned to run but found himself frozen, his body refusing to obey as the song of something older than time itself filled his head with promises and secrets. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the hum stopped. The silence was like a physical blow, leaving Joel collapsed on his knees in the damp earth, gasping for air that tasted of decay and age-old stone. When he finally found the courage to look back at the pit, it was empty, the darkness impenetrable. But he knew, with a certainty that went bone deep, that something had seen him, marked him, added him to an ancient tally of those who had heard its song. Joel filed a report with the Park Service the next morning, his hands shaking as he typed. He recommended that Pinecrest Trail be closed indefinitely, citing dangerous ground conditions and structural instability from the old mining operations. He didn't mention the eyes or the pit. He wasn't sure anyone would believe him, wasn't sure he believed it himself in the harsh light of day. But as he signed off on the paperwork, listening to the faint hum that still lingered at the edges of his awareness, he couldn't shake the feeling that the forest wasn't done with him. The hum still lingered in his mind, a haunting melody that refused to fade, a song that had become part of his internal rhythm. It wasn't just the land holding memories. It was something deeper, something alive, something that had been waiting since the first humans dared to dig into the earth's dark places. And whatever it was, Joel knew it would keep calling, drawing people into its grasp with its siren song of secrets and ancient knowledge, until someone found a way to silence it for good, or until it finally got what it wanted. He sat at his desk, listening to the hum that only he could hear, and wondered which would come first.
Park Ranger Ethan Harper loved the solitude of Raven Rock National Park, though he'd never admit the real reason why. The miles of dense forest and rugged trails meant he could go hours without seeing another soul, without having to explain the haunted look in his eyes, or why he flinched at sudden movements. The divorce had left him hollow, and the forest filled that void with its vast silence. During the day, towering pines whispered secrets in the wind, and sunshine dappled the forest floor like nature's stained glass. But after sunset, when shadows lengthened into grasping fingers and familiar paths twisted into uncertain mazes, the forest revealed its other face. Alien, menacing, and hungry for something Ethan couldn't name. It started with a call that seemed routine enough, though later he'd remember how the static had crackled differently that day, how the dispatcher's voice had wavered ever so slightly. "Hiker reported a rope bridge that's not on any map," dispatch had said over the radio, the words fighting through interference that seemed thicker than usual. "West Ridge Ravine, near marker 23. Caller sounded distressed. Ethan frowned, his weathered fingers tracing the topographical lines on the map spread across his truck's dashboard. He'd been working in the park for 3 years, 4 months, and 12 days. Not that he was counting, and knew every mapped trail like the lines on his palms. There was no bridge near marker 23, at least, not officially. The ravine there was too steep, too dangerous for standard park infrastructure. Must have been a mistake or a prank, he thought, though something in his gut tightened at the way the dispatcher had hesitated. Still, protocol required him to investigate, and protocol was comforting in its rigid predictability. The sun was already dipping below the horizon by the time Ethan reached the area, painting the sky in bruised purples and sickly oranges. Marker 23 stood like a lonely sentinel at the edge of a steep ravine, its metal surface dulled by years of exposure. The sides of the chasm were lined with jagged rocks that seemed to catch the fading light wrong, casting shadows that moved when you weren't looking directly at them. Thick underbrush choked the edges, thorny vines twisting together in ways that reminded Ethan of barbed wire. The air felt cooler here, heavy with a moisture that clung to his skin like cold sweat and carried the musty scent of decay. He scanned the area with his flashlight, the beam cutting through the gathering gloom. At first, there was nothing unusual, just the expected tangle of vegetation and stone. But as he swept the light across the ravine, it caught something that made his breath catch in his throat. A rope bridge, stretching across the void like a spider's web. The bridge was both ancient and impossible. Its wooden planks were weathered to a color that spoke of decades of exposure, yet they showed no signs of rot. Thick ropes secured it to massive trees on either side, the fibers frayed but somehow maintaining their integrity. The entire structure sagged slightly, as though bearing an invisible weight. It looked old but maintained, as if some unseen caretaker had been tending to it just enough to keep it functional. Though functional for what? Ethan's mind refused to contemplate. He keyed his radio, trying to ignore how his hand trembled slightly. "Dispatch, this is Harper. I found the bridge. Looks..." He paused, searching for words that wouldn't make him sound crazy. "Old, but intact. No sign of the hiker who reported it." The static that answered seemed to carry whispers beneath its white noise. The response finally crackled through, distorted and distant. "Roger that. Proceed with caution." Was there a note of fear in the dispatcher's voice? Or was that just his imagination, playing tricks in the growing dark? Ethan approached the bridge with the careful steps of someone approaching a sleeping predator. His flashlight beam traced along the ropes and planks, revealing details that seemed to shift when viewed directly. Knots that weren't quite right, wooden grain that flowed against nature's patterns. There were no signs of fresh footprints in the dirt or disturbed vegetation, as if the bridge had simply materialized from the twilight air. But as he stepped closer, an unsettling sensation washed over him, like walking through an invisible cobweb that clung to his skin. The forest had grown unnaturally still, as if holding its breath in anticipation. The familiar evening chorus of cicadas had fallen silent, leaving behind a vacuum that pressed against his eardrums. Even the wind seemed to have died, though somehow the leaves still moved, trembling with an energy that had nothing to do with natural forces. He hesitated, looking back the way he'd come. The trail leading to the ravine was already shrouded in shadows that seemed too deep for the time of day, too solid for mere absence of light. It would be dark soon, and this was one of the most remote sections of the park. Logic screamed at him to leave, to report the bridge and return in daylight with backup, with witnesses, with anything to validate what his eyes were telling him. But something about the bridge pulled at him, a magnetic force that tugged at more than just his body. It felt fundamentally wrong, like a word spelled backward, or a familiar face with the features slightly rearranged. The wrongness itself drew him forward, a moth to an anti-flame that promised darkness instead of light. Ethan tested the first plank with his boot, the wood releasing a sound that was almost but not quite a normal creak. Too musical, too intentional. It held firm despite its aged appearance, and slowly, fighting against both instinct and reason, he stepped onto the bridge. His hands gripped the ropes on either side, and he could have sworn they pulsed beneath his fingers, like arteries thick with cold blood. The structure swayed slightly under his weight, but it was surprisingly sturdy for something that looked so aged, so forgotten. As he crossed, the sensation of being watched intensified until it was almost a physical pressure on the back of his neck. He paused halfway across, turning his flashlight back toward the forest. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their branches twisting into shapes that suggested reaching hands, grasping claws, hungry mouths. The shadows between them seemed deeper than natural darkness allowed, and something about their edges writhed in ways that made his eyes hurt. He saw nothing solid, nothing he could point to and name, but the feeling of countless invisible eyes fixed upon him grew stronger with each passing moment. When he reached the other side, Ethan stopped, his lungs struggling against air that seemed too thick to breathe. The trail here was narrow and overgrown, choked with vegetation that looked wrong in subtle ways, leaves that curved inward like grasping fingers, thorns that seemed to track his movement, vines that twisted in patterns that suggested written warnings in a language too alien to comprehend. It looked as if it hadn't been used in years, or perhaps had never been meant for human feet at all. He turned to look back at the bridge, and his flashlight beam caught something that made his heart stutter. The structure seemed even older now, the wood darker and more warped, the ropes more frayed. But it wasn't just age. The bridge appeared fundamentally different, as if crossing it had somehow changed its very nature. The knots in the rope now formed patterns that hurt his eyes to look at, and the wooden planks seemed to bend at angles that shouldn't have been possible. The air pressed against him like a physical weight, cold and heavy with a dampness that seemed to seep into his bones. Each breath felt like drawing in liquid instead of air, and the pressure in his chest built until he had to consciously force himself to inhale. His radio crackled faintly, but the static had taken on an almost organic quality, like the sound of insects skittering across dead leaves. Any words that might have been trying to reach him were lost in that unsettling noise. Ethan pressed forward, each step feeling like a decision he couldn't take back. He told himself he was hoping to find a clearing, or some sign of the hiker who'd reported the bridge, but deep down, he knew he was being drawn forward by something else, something that pulled at him with invisible threads, puppet strings made of shadow and whispers. The trail wound deeper into the forest, the trees growing denser and more twisted with each step. Their branches reached across the path overhead, weaving together into a canopy that seemed designed to trap him beneath it. The beam of his flashlight appeared dimmer here, as if the darkness was somehow thicker, more resistant to illumination. The light didn't so much pierce the shadows as it was absorbed by them, leaving only enough visibility to make out shapes that seemed to change when viewed directly. Then he saw it, a campsite that simultaneously drew him forward and made every instinct scream at him to run. It was tucked into a small clearing that felt more like a wound in the forest's flesh than a natural opening. The remains of a fire pit sat at its center, the ashes within it cold, but somehow not scattered despite the time that must have passed. A tent stood nearby, its fabric torn in ways that suggested claws or desperate hands, the tatters flapping gently in a breeze that Ethan couldn't feel against his skin. Rusted cooking utensils and scattered belongings littered the ground like the aftermath of a struggle, or perhaps a frenzied departure. everything abandoned in a moment of panic that had left its echo in the air. Ethan stepped closer, though every muscle in his body protested the movement. His flashlight beam revealed more details he almost wished he hadn't noticed. A boot print in the dirt that ended mid-step, as if its owner had simply vanished mid-stride. A water bottle with strange teeth marks puncturing the metal. A camera with its lens shattered from within. The tent drew his attention like a black hole draws light. He approached it slowly, the beam of his flashlight illuminating the interior through the tears in the fabric. Inside, he found a backpack slumped against one wall like an empty skin, and a sleeping bag that lay twisted in a way that suggested its occupant had fought to escape it. But it was the notebook that made his blood run cold. A simple, spiral-bound pad lying open on the ground, its pages damp with something that might have been morning dew, but smelled metallic and wrong. The writing was barely legible, the ink smeared and running as if it had been fighting to escape the page. But Ethan could make out enough to make his stomach clench. The bridge wasn't there before. I know it wasn't. I've hiked this trail a dozen times, but now it's the only way back, and it's changing, shifting every time I look at it. The forest is wrong here. The shadows move when they think I'm not watching. They're hungry. They're waiting. If you're reading this, don't. The rest of the page dissolved into frantic scribbles and dark stains that Ethan refused to examine too closely. His hands shook as he set the notebook down, and that's when the temperature seemed to drop another 10 degrees. The oppressive silence that had been pressing against his ears suddenly felt expectant, like an audience holding its breath before the curtain rises. And then he heard it, the creak of the rope bridge, echoing through the unnatural stillness with deliberate, rhythmic precision. It was the sound of footsteps, but wrong, too measured, too heavy, and coming from a structure that shouldn't have been there at all. Ethan turned, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness toward the sound. The dense woods blocked his view of the bridge, but the noise was unmistakable. The groaning of planks under weight, the soft sway of the ropes, and underneath it all, a sound like dry leaves rustling, or perhaps whispered words in a language too old for human tongues. "Hello?" he called out, immediately regretting breaking the silence. His voice echoed strangely, as if the words were being caught and twisted before being returned to him. "Is someone there?" The creaking stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so complete it rang in his ears. But in that silence, Ethan could have sworn he heard something laugh. A soft, dry sound, like autumn leaves crumbling to dust. A chill that had nothing to do with the temperature ran down his spine, and the darkness around him seemed to pulse with a life of its own. He began retracing his steps, moving as quickly as he dared on the uncertain ground. The trail seemed to actively resist his progress now, as if the forest itself was trying to keep him there. Branches snagged at his clothes with deliberate malice, and the ground shifted treacherously beneath his boots, holes and roots appearing where he was certain none had been before. When he finally reached the ravine, the sight before him stopped him cold, his heart seeming to stutter in his chest. The bridge was gone. Ethan stared in disbelief, his flashlight beam sweeping frantically across the chasm. The ropes, the planks, the entire structure had vanished as if it had never existed. The ravine stretched out before him, a black mouth yawning in the darkness, impassable and hungry. Panic clawed at his throat as he scanned the area, searching desperately for any sign of the bridge or an alternate path. But the darkness seemed to swallow his light before it could reveal anything useful. His fingers fumbled for his radio, pressing the transmit button so hard it hurt. "Dispatch, this is Harper," he said, his voice shaking more than he wanted to admit. "The bridge is gone. I'm stranded on the far side. Do you copy? Please, do you copy?" The radio crackled in response, but instead of a human voice, he heard only a sound like distant laughter mixed with the rustling of dead leaves. As the hours passed, The forest grew darker and more oppressive, as if the night here was something more than just an absence of light. Ethan's flashlight flickered and dimmed, the batteries draining at an impossible rate. He tried to stay calm, falling back on his ranger training, marking his position, searching methodically for alternate routes, conserving his resources. But every path he took seemed to loop back on itself, leading him in circles that spiraled ever deeper into the dark heart of the forest. The whispers started just after midnight, when the darkness was absolute, and the cold had seeped so deeply into his bones that he couldn't remember what warmth felt like. At first, they were faint, almost indistinguishable from the rustling of leaves in a wind that didn't exist. But as the night wore on, they grew clearer, more insistent. Voices overlapped and intertwined, speaking words that seemed to hover just on the edge of comprehension, familiar enough to make his brain strain to understand them, but alien enough to make his teeth ache when he tried. Ethan gritted his teeth, gripping his flashlight like a lifeline. "Who's there?" he demanded, hating how his voice cracked with fear. "This isn't funny anymore." The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so complete it felt like a physical pressure against his eardrums. For a moment, the forest seemed to hold its breath. Then, from the corner of his eye, he caught movement, a figure darting between the trees, its motion too fluid to be human, its pale form seeming to emit a sickly light of its own. He swung his flashlight toward it, but the beam only illuminated empty air and twisted branches that seemed to reach for him with deliberate purpose. By the time dawn finally began to break, Ethan was exhausted beyond anything he'd ever experienced. He'd spent the night in constant motion, trying to keep the whispers and shadows at bay, though he knew deep down that he was the one being herded, manipulated, guided by forces he couldn't begin to understand. When the first gray light of morning filtered through the trees, he felt a fleeting sense of relief, until he realized the light looked wrong, too weak and watery, as if it were struggling to penetrate whatever membrane separated this place from the normal world. But as this strange parody of sunlight illuminated the ravine, he froze. The bridge was back. It looked exactly as it had before, yet somehow fundamentally different. The ropes writhed slightly, like sleeping snakes, and the wooden planks seemed to shift and flow when he wasn't looking directly at them. It stretched across the chasm, as if it had never disappeared, offering an escape that felt more like a trap. Ethan approached it cautiously, his body aching from the night's ordeal, his mind screaming warnings he couldn't afford to heed. He tested the first plank with his boot. It creaked in that same wrong way, but held firm. The feeling of wrongness returned stronger than ever, every instinct telling him not to cross. But what choice did he have? He couldn't stay here, in this place where darkness had weight and shadows had teeth. Taking a deep breath of air that felt too thick to be real, he stepped onto the bridge. Halfway across, the whispers returned, louder now and more insistent, forming words that almost made sense. Almost, but not quite. And he was grateful for that small mercy. The ropes swayed violently, though there was no wind, and beneath his feet, the planks seemed to ripple like the surface of a disturbed pond. Ethan gripped the sides tightly, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst, and forced himself to keep moving forward, one step at a time, trying to ignore how each plank felt softer than the last, more organic, more alive. When he reached the other side, the whispers stopped as suddenly as they had begun. The forest ahead looked normal again, the trees standing straight and innocent in the strengthening daylight, the air feeling lighter and real in his lungs. He turned to look back at the bridge, knowing what he would see but needing to confirm it anyway, and found only empty air spanning the ravine, no sign that anything had ever bridged the gap between what was real and what was other. Ethan didn't wait to make sense of it. He couldn't. His mind shied away from the implications, like fingers recoiling from a hot stove. He radioed dispatch and reported his position, claiming he'd gotten lost after nightfall, the lie tasting like ashes in his mouth. He left out the details of the bridge and the whispers, the notebook and its warnings, the night spent running from things that shouldn't exist. How could he explain something he didn't understand, something he wasn't even sure had really happened? But as he hiked back to the station on shaking legs, he couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was watching him with new interest, like a predator that had acquired the taste for particular prey. And when he closed his eyes that night, and every night after, he dreamed of the bridge, creaking, swaying, waiting for him to cross again. In his dreams, the whispers were clearer, and he understood what they were saying. And he woke screaming every time, the words evaporating like dew in the morning sun, leaving only the certainty that something out there was waiting, and that one day he would have to cross that bridge again.